Hello there, fearfully and wonderfully made humans. Welcome back to the Holistic Counselor Podcast, where faith, science, and holistic healing intersect. I'm your host, Diana, from Through the Valley Therapy and Transform Mind Consulting and Coaching. Today's episode is one I've been holding in my heart for a while. We're diving into a topic that's becoming increasingly urgent for parents, therapists, teachers, and really anyone who cares about mental health in the next generation. I'm honored to welcome John Puls to the show. John is a licensed clinical social worker, master's level certified addiction professional, and expert witness who's been working in the trenches of substance use and co occurring disorders for over a decade. He's the co founder and COO of Full Life Comprehensive Care here in South Florida. He's also an adjunct professor at FAU and a fierce advocate for systems level change, especially when it comes to addiction treatment, community care, and trauma informed mental health. I first met John at a legal training in Boca. Actually, I think I met you before that because we run in the same circles. But I remember you speaking alongside Mark Astor, and Mark Astor I interviewed on episode 88. I've also attended his full life events in Fort Lauderdale, and let me tell you, John's heart for this work is undeniable. His expertise and boots on the ground experience are exactly what we need right now. So, why are we talking about marijuana and psychosis today? Well, let me take you back. I used to work with teens, and while I don't anymore because those cases became incredibly heavy, what I was starting to see during that season shook me. More and more adolescents were being Baker acted. They were misdiagnosed with schizophrenia or bipolar disorder, but the real culprit, cannabis induced psychosis. And not the old school weed from the 80s. We're talking about lab altered high potency THC, Delta 8, vapes, edibles, and medical marijuana cartridges, products that look sleek and harmless, but are hijacking the developing teenage brain and triggering mental health spirals no one saw coming. I say this not just as a clinician, but someone who's been there. Listen, I smoked pot and a lot of it in the 80s, okay? And in 2020, and I stopped for a while, and in 2020, during a high stress season, I gave medical marijuana a shot, thinking it might help. At first, it did, but then it wrecked me. Anxiety, disassociation, physical symptoms I couldn't explain. And that was me as a grown woman with a regulated nervous system and tools. So imagine what this is doing to 13-year-olds, 15-year-olds, and 17-year-olds. And this is why I asked John to come on the show. Because too many clinicians, including me at one point, parents and community leaders still think this is just 1900s weed from the 1900s. But what's on the market in this day and age is not the same plant. And the mental health consequences, particularly for teens, are so real. So if you're a clinician seeing this in your practice, if you're a parent wondering what's happening to your kid, and if you're a community leader trying to understand how to respond, this episode is for you. John, thank you so much for being here with me.
Thank you for having me, Diana.
All right. So let's start with you and your story. And after hearing my introduction,
Yeah.
what's what's going on? What are you seeing? What's happening? How did you end up here at um, full life comprehensive? And what are you seeing without throwing
Oh,
anyone
yeah.
under the bus?
Absolutely, of course. So I started my career actually working at a Baker Act receiving facility, so crisis stabilization unit. That was my first job in the field. So people that are coming in crisis. And I also, at the time, was doing some case management for a lot of folks that had been through various Baker Act receiving facilities. And that is when I encountered my first case that I was aware of cannabis induced psychosis. And so I remember I was working with a young man who had come down to South Florida for treatment, which is a very frequent occurrence. And I was speaking to the psychiatrist, and he explained that although he had a diagnosis of schizophrenia, that it was brought about by cannabis in this particular case, because of course there's essentially a couple outcomes that can happen when somebody has cannabis-induced psychosis, whether it's an adolescent or a young adult. They can either return to a baseline. So after an initial psychotic episode, give it 12 hours, 24 hours, 48 hours, they return to a baseline. And it's more or less as if nothing happened. It can be very traumatic, obviously, but they go back to a normal state. And then there are other cases where the psychosis can persist. And sometimes the individual will still go back to a baseline, maybe after, let's say, 2, 3 months. And then there are cases, unfortunately, where I've seen people have and develop what's called a persistent psychotic disorder. So something like schizophrenia. And this is what happened to that young man. And I'll be totally honest, Diana, when I first heard the psychiatrist explaining it, I didn't believe him.
Exactly.
Right. And because in my mind, I'm like, well, that's not the pot that I consumed. Right. Like, I don't know anybody that experienced psychosis when I was, using cannabis in like, early 2000s. And I was in high school. And so it didn't really make a lot of sense to me. And so, again, candidly, I didn't really believe him. And then I started looking up the research, speaking to him more, and really seeing the intense struggle about this. And then more and more, I started seeing cases. And I tend to have a bit of a obsessive personality. So when I see something that's like interesting and I can't understand it, like I want to research it more. And then all of a sudden, I started seeing all these families and all these cases that had been impacted by it due to the cannabis of this era.
Yeah. Yeah, John. Like, and I think a lot of people still don't understand that because I worked with some parents. Listen, I mean, back in the 1900s, yeah, I'm that old. Yeah, like I remember, like the THC. I mean, because that's what it is. It's the THC, and many people don't know. And so you have like, say, the hippie parents that smoked pot back then, and now they're, oh yeah, what's one joint smoking with my parent? Well, first of all, it's illegal, but you know what I mean by that, right? We
Mhm.
live in a society that, alcohol and marijuana are seen as let's have fun and party. And I mean, I remember in high school and stuff like that, but they're not noticing that the stuff that's coming out of these dispensaries are so
Mhm.
strong. And what I'm seeing too is they're smoking the cartridges and taking in hardcore THC like 90% because back in the day it was like 4% or something. Then they're playing video games all night long. Many of them. I'm not saying all. It's just like a perfect hurricane.
Yeah, it really is. It really is perfect hurricane. And I want to talk about the THC percentages for a moment, right?
Please, yes.
Because so a lot of the earlier research, so they did a lot of research in the 90s about medical marijuana. That's when it was first became popular. It was first legalized for medical use in California and a few other states. Basically, what states do across the country is they first legalize for medical, and then there's
Mm-hmm.
an eventual push to legalize it for recreational.
Right.
And so the research they did and the purported health benefits and mental health benefits of cannabis, the THC percentage was between 2 to 5%, right? And so that was what all the research was based on, was that low dose THC.
Mm-hmm.
And so to your point, nowadays you would be hard pressed to even find any type of cannabis that has 2 to 5% THC, whether it's in a medical, recreational dispensary, or frankly, even bought illicitly. You're not going to find that. That's not what is being sold. And so,
Right.
and it actually, so the concentrates, which are the cartridges, is it's essentially oil that's being vaporized, and those percentages can actually be all the way up to 99%
Oh my
THC.
gosh. Wow.
And and in particular, when it gets that high, people are often using what are called dabs, which are it's essentially like almost like hardened oil that you need a specialized device to use,
Really?
called a dab rig. And
Okay.
so when it's that concentrated, that's when you're seeing those really severe adverse effects.
Oh my God.
And and I think what's the most tragic is that the real adverse effects you see in adolescents and young adults. I appreciate the experience you shared about when you decided to look into medical cannabis in 2020. And while adults, right, let's say over the age of 30, certainly do experience adverse effects, and cannabis-induced psychosis can absolutely happen, into, adulthood, middle age, older adults, but it's much less common. Where we see most people having this type of psychotic break are really adolescents and young adults.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, because let's talk about that a little. Well, first of all, you're teaching me something because even though I work with, even though I worked with teenagers for when I came back to being a therapist, okay, so I came back to being a therapist in 2018. So I worked as an adolescent counselor in schools, and
Hmm.
then I stopped around 2012 and then came back in 2018. And so when I came back in 2018, all those years, so much stuff happened. And I was still learning about what was happening, even though I have my own kids and my own teenagers and my own teenager and stuff. But I don't know it all. You have to be like, I'm not in the substance use world. Okay, that's not the kind of therapist I am. This is why I go to you guys' stuff all the time. That's why you see me at every single, well, first of all, I want to get out of this office. Second of all, I love to learn. I'm like you, John. Like when I'm interested, I go into these rabbit holes and I want to know the real science about behind it. I want to understand it. So in case someone comes to me, I can help them, right? Because like to me, I'm going to be like, no, go to John, go to John. If
Yeah,
parents come to me or, our community that we have together here in South Florida. But the the marijuana that okay, you said dabs and you explained it a little. Can you explain it? Because this podcast actually many people in churches and in the BIPOC community, the Black Indigenous people of color, I have parents that listen. I have many people from all walks of life that might not even know any of this, right? They don't
yeah,
know any about this and they're just thinking, oh no. Some of them might be like, oh no, that's just, they're possessed by the devil. Okay.
right.
Or something like that. Or they're just like, no, not my kid. Like he would
Yeah,
never touch drugs.
yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
So can you explain a little more about all these, like the cartridges, Delta 8, and all those things? Whatever you know, can you please explain
Hmm.
it to my audience? Like it's the first
Oh,
time
yeah.
you've ever heard of this?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So the first thing I want to break down is really the difference between medical and recreational, right? So the first thing I want to say is that medical cannabis does not mean safe, right? So it's the same product, whether it's medical or recreational. And basically, what you have is a combination of what most adolescents and adults call flower, right? So that would be the traditional. We'll call it marijuana classic, right? So that's the
Yeah.
typical the dried buds that you
Hmm.
put in a bong, roll in a joint, whatever it may be. And typically, the flower is lower dose THC, but not low dose, right? So you're still going to have a THC percentage with the traditional cannabis flower of anywhere from like 40 to 60%, maybe on the lower end 20%, which is still very high historically. And then you have the cartridges. Now the cartridges are, basically the size of a thumb drive, very easy to conceal. The odor that's eliminated from those devices is much less than flowers. So, a lot of adolescents prefer that because you can more easily conceal it. And then we have and then the edibles, obviously, which have different, and those can be, brownies, cupcakes, gummy worms, whatever it may be. They can basically be put into anything. And what I'm seeing a really high amount of use of are what are called the concentrates. So that is the dabs. It's often referred to as like shatter or butter, and it almost looks like glass.
Wow.
Um, and it's what it is it's concentrated THC that cannot be smoked in a normal way, right? So let's say, you can't put it into a bong, you can't roll it into a joint. You have to use a specialized device called a dab rig.
Okay.
And basically it involves like heating up a piece of metal, melting it a little bit, and then smoking it.
Oh my
Yeah.
goodness.
And
It's
then
like
and if
crack
you
from the 80s.
yes, it is. And it's funny that you mentioned that. So I do a lot of crisis intervention work, and I've actually seen this being used, and it doesn't look like any cannabis. Like if you picture somebody using cannabis, you don't picture this at all.
Okay.
And so it's very, very concerning because of the concentrates. And then so that's basically a general overview. Then we have Delta 8
Yeah.
and Delta 10 and THCA, right? And all these are derivatives of hemp. So quick distinction. So in 2018, there was what was called the 2018 Farm Bill, okay? And that basically fully legalized hemp for production. Now, If now traditionally hemp, if it's a hemp or what's called CBD product, right, which is very commonly used, it should be less than 0.5% THC. Okay. So if
Okay.
it's less than 0.5% THC, for the most part, it's really not psychoactive, meaning you're not going to get any type of intoxicating effects. But with Delta 8, Delta 10, and THCA, they've been able to derive it from hemp while still having the psychoactive effects of THC.
Wow. I didn't know that.
So what that created is essentially a loophole. So Florida is actually a perfect example to explain this loophole. So we are legal currently, although there's been a big push to legalize for recreational. We
Mhm.
are currently only legal for medical, which means loosely that you have to see a medical doctor, you have to be over the age of 18, and you have to get, a card or a
Right.
prescription.
I had a license.
Right, a license, right? And
Hmm.
I'm sure if you're familiar with the process to get that license, right? It's not exactly very sophisticated, right?
Well, honestly,
Yeah,
though, I want to say something
yeah,
because
yeah,
I do, and this is where we're going to have to really talk about this
yeah.
because it's not going away. All right.
Sure.
And us becoming teetotalers or
Yeah,
abolitionists, I get it. Like
yeah,
more things are coming. Okay. This is, we got fentanyl crisis. We have so many different situations. And to me, I know with medical marijuana, if it's done responsibly, I guess. I haven't really met someone yet, but my doctor was adamant not to do it. And I said, well, I don't want to take a prescription pill. And this is
mm,
why, for my anxiety, she's like, well, I can. And she goes, I don't feel like, you know what I mean? Because this is the thing. It was just because I'm a very much of a naturalist. And to me, I
yeah,
was thinking, marijuana grown from the plant. I'd rather do that than go on benzos, for example,
sure. Mhm.
right?
Yeah,
But we have to let the audience know that anything could be an addiction.
right. Oh, absolutely. And I want to say that there are plenty of adults who responsibly use
Mhm.
medical cannabis and experience little to no adverse effects. That is absolutely true.
Exactly. Yeah.
And I don't want anything I'm saying today to be in conflict with any of that. So
Yeah.
I completely agree. I just think it's important to know that the adverse effects we really see with young people, right?
Yeah.
And that's for a whole host of reasons that we can get into. But to kind of put a bow on the Delta 8, right? So there's the medical recreational, but so Delta 8 falls into a loophole. Delta 8, Delta 10, THCA, because so it doesn't need to be regulated by a medical marijuana dispensary. It can be
Okay.
sold completely legally,
Oh,
right?
I
So
see them
like
all over the place.
right. Oh, yeah. And if you go down to the Keys, for example, I mean, they have entire stores
Yeah.
that are just Delta 8, Delta 10 THCA stores. And now there have been some states that have made that illegal. The issue, obviously, is it's completely unregulated. So you really don't know what you're getting at all.
Right.
And so but that's essentially like the breakdown of all of it, the different types of
Yeah.
products.
Yeah, thank you for that because you just learned me. You just
Yeah.
taught me a lot. And that's why, I mean, I like I said, like I get a lot of information from all these CEUs, even though I don't need them all. I just go because I want to be up to date with everything just in case somebody comes in and I'm like, okay, I can't help you, but here is somebody that can. I don't want to have this like fear in case there's parents like, oh my God, because I know I'm a parent. I have four kids and I have six grandchildren and I get it. And this is what my it's not fear that I have. I want to educate. It's informed consent. It is understanding because this is how I raised all my kids, right? Because it is not about sheltering them. It's about filtering them to have an understanding. Here are the choices that are going to happen in middle school.
Mhm.
Here are the stuff that can happen in high school without taking away all their innocence, age appropriate, right? But because I know what I've seen and you're in it. I mean, I remember we were supposed to record and you're like, no, I have a crisis, Diana. We have to redo this. I'm like, I understand completely. I was hoping when 12 o'clock, I'm like, oh, is he coming today? And I'm so grateful for you being here because many of you that I know personally are in it. You are in the trenches. How do we prevent? Because it's not about taking it all. Honestly, how are you going to take this stuff away? We're not. It seems like every generation has their crisis. of drug addiction and alcohol and everything, any addiction, honestly. How do we help now the next generation, John?
Yeah, that's a great question, especially considering you're absolutely right. This isn't going anywhere. In fact, it's probably going to be continue to be legalized
Mhm.
and kind of greater scale and more access. And so prevention is huge. And I've actually had the privilege of speaking at a lot of local high schools. And I remember the first time I was asked to speak, I was reluctant because my assumption was that the school wanted me to come in and do Dare 2.0, right? And it's not effective, right? So I mean, we know this based on research. Dare is not an effective
For
method.
those that don't know what DARE
Yeah,
is, can you explain it a little?
yeah, sure. So there was this big campaign that I recall very specifically in high school that was basically like dare to resist drugs, right? So they would
Mhm.
do these skits like involving drug dealers and police. So it was mainly a law enforcement thing, which is interesting. So they really wouldn't have clinicians that would facilitate any of this. It was
Right.
mostly like law enforcement and school officials. And they would try to dare kids to resist drugs and violence, right? That was the
Mhm.
idea. And it's a good idea in theory, but the methods that they used were mostly to try to scare kids
Oh,
into not
yes.
using. And they would use these like this extreme hyperbole, these crazy scenarios, and these things that ultimately weren't true. And kids could see through it and they knew it wasn't genuine. And so when I was first asked to speak, I said, look, I'm happy. I'm happy to speak, right? Like I'm happy to speak to the students. But what I won't do is come in with any type of like scared straight method. I'm going to like give like comprehensive education and speak to them honestly. And what I found is that kids really were really interested when I took that approach, right? I wasn't talking down to them, wasn't talking
Exactly.
at them, wasn't criticizing them, wasn't trying to scare them. It
Right.
was more just like, hey, like these are the facts, these are the outcomes, these are why people use. And I think that's much more beneficial. Look, I think many people for years have viewed some type of experimentation with substances almost as a rite of passage, a normal part of maturation and moving into adulthood. And perhaps that's true, but the risks of that are different today. And so
Yes.
I think that to your point of informed consent, my goal when I do a lot of these talks or these presentations, because I do a combination of both like professional like CE events and then also more community-based presentations for like parents and families through NAMI and stuff like that.
Oh,
And
cool.
so my goal is always to educate, right? It's just kind of like lay the facts down and for families and people and kids as well, adolescents to observe so that they can make informed decisions. Because if you don't know, you don't know.
Right.
And even from like a harm reduction standpoint, right? When the feedback that I've gotten from high school kids is they've said, hey, one of the things that really took away from what you said is I'm going to stay away from the dabs, the concentrates. I'm going to be really mindful at what percentage THC I'm using because that's really where we see the adverse effects. It's not necessarily that like low dose cannabis is harmless, but it's much less harmful than the high potency cannabis that's used more frequently today.
Yeah. Okay. So how, like, and I hate to say it this way, but like, how old do you think a parent, like, say my kids are listening, right? Because I have
Mhm.
grandkids. And because to me, I'm always like, from birth, you start all conversations from birth. And they're like, yeah, no, that's that's not happening. But I think it's just because of, how I am and my past experience. Because honestly, let's talk about this a little bit. I mean, you say you remember when you were an adolescent. I remember when I was a teenager here in Broward and how I started smoking marijuana. Like, I come from a background that I felt safer at school than at home.
Mm.
Okay. And I had a lot of anxiety. And I'm in middle school. I want to be accepted. And guess what? Someone said, "Here, try this." And I'm still curious person, but I utilize my curiosity in a better, healthier way now. But this is what we see, right? A rite of passage, a rite of like, and no one ever talked to me. The dare stuff, I would look at that going, what? Like, are you kidding? Like, here's your brain. Here's your brain on drugs. Any question? Do you remember the fried egg commercial?
Oh yeah, of course. I actually use that video in the presentations on
Oh.
presentations I do, right? To show like what not to do in terms of
Yeah.
education and prevention.
Yes.
Yeah,
Okay. I mean, and I was never, even though I had anxiety and I was fearful of some things, that never scared me because what marijuana did to my system made me feel so flippin' good.
right.
Okay.
Yeah,
I had no tool set. I had no, I didn't know about health and wellness and they don't teach this stuff at school like they should, right? Can you imagine if schools were taught fitness, finances, food,
yeah. Oh, it'd be incredible. Yeah,
right? So let's talk now what's happening now and what you're seeing in the future of prevention. Like if you were able to really shift and change things to help these young people to understand because who knows maybe there's a teenager listening right now and they're smoking and I actually work with I have a few adults that are smoking medical marijuana and they want to quit and so we're
yeah.
utilizing different methods in order because like just like alcohol does something for a person, right? How do we
Hmm.
how do we prevent it? What do you think would be helpful? And what age should a parent start talking about this stuff? What do you think?
Yeah. So what I always recommend, I mean, obviously age appropriate discussions, but I think that where we really see based on research, the most frequent introduction to these types of substances is generally junior high, so sixth, seventh grade. So that's typically like the ages that I recommend having more like serious and direct, like honest conversations. And the first thing is kids are really smart,
Yeah, they
right?
are.
So don't come in with like any type of like crazy like scenarios. Just like be honest. And the truth is, even if they're not using at sixth, seventh, eighth grade, they probably know some people that are, right? And so they're going to be exposed to it.
Yes.
And so what I always like to say is that like, look, in terms of like educating, that's the age group for sure. And what I would love to see is more schools implement more comprehensive education around these substances. But I think that they're so concerned, like there's this fear that if you talk to kids about it, then that's going to pique their interest and they're going to do it,
Yeah,
right?
it's the same with sex. Like
Yeah, same.
sex, drugs, and rock and roll. You talk about any of those things, you think you're going into all these different wormholes.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think the real fear too is like, and parents feel this way and schools too, is that if you talk about it, that's going to influence them to do it. But
Yeah,
that's not
right,
really, there's no evidence to suggest that, right? So
right,
there's no correlation between, they give a sex ed, class presentation, then a bunch of kids go have sex, right? There's no correlation between
right.
that. And it's the same thing with substance use. So I think the first thing is we have to remove this fear we have of having the discussion, right? It's
Hmm.
okay to talk about it. It's
Yes.
okay to talk about it at that age. And then, having people come in and give honest education and resources for them to understand what the risks are, and generally, and again, the feedback that I've gotten is that from adolescents themselves is I wish I would have known,
Yeah.
right?
I wish I
That I
would have
wish I
known.
I wish I would have known that I could have a psychotic break, that could end up in the hospital, that I could have a panic attack. There's something that's been happening a lot too. It's called cannabinoid hyperemesis syndrome,
Yes.
um,
Please
which
explain
is,
that. Yeah.
yeah, absolutely. So cannabinoid hyperemesis syndrome essentially, it doesn't happen to everyone, but the kids will often call it greening out, right? That's what they say, like, oh, he's greening out. And basically, what will happen is they have profuse vomiting and extreme stomach pain, to the point of, and it's typically only during intoxication or immediately following. And then what ends up happening is, they have these persistent stomach problems, so they don't realize that it's directly linked to the cannabis use.
Right.
So they go to GI specialists, they go to the emergency room, and now doctors are getting a little better with it, but they didn't used to screen for cannabinoid hyperemesis syndrome. So they didn't used to ask, like, hey, are you, using any high potency cannabis products by chance? Because this is the side effect. And I remember a kid I was working with, and he was convinced that the cannabis was the only thing that was helping his nausea and his
Hmm.
vomiting and his
Well, I
GI
mean,
issues.
Think
And
about it. Yeah.
yeah, and for some people it does. That's
Yes,
the
like
crazy part.
cancer patients. Like I know
Yes.
cancer and I'm like, yes, like that's what I mean. Like this is medicinal. Like it's a plant. I get it, but there's plants all over. And just because
Yeah.
it's just so frustrating to me because I mean, people are like, well, cocaine's a plant too. And I'm like, yeah, I get it. Like and then indigenous people would utilize certain things and you have herbalists out there and I understand the world, right? My family doesn't come from America. So like they taught
Right.
me different things in different places. But they also said like it isn't about doing it every freaking day, overdoing it, and why are you doing it? That
Mm.
right? Why? Why is it? And you're right. Like marijuana and nausea would go together.
Yeah, absolutely. And so again, yeah, I mean, I think there is and most medicinal effects, responsible use of cannabis, which there's a number of different reasons, but that happens, after the age of 30. Not to say that like, no one should ever use prior to that,
Right.
but the reality is your brain's fully developed. You've hopefully developed some coping skills
Hmm.
and some other ways to regulate your nervous system. You're not necessarily using cannabis as a coping skill like you were using it in high school,
Oh my
right?
gosh. Yes.
And to be fair, for some people, it does alleviate some emotional distress and nervous system problems. But really, the issue is like trying to find a balance between, okay, yes, this can be responsibly used, but how and when?
Right.
Because for most adolescents and young adults, it's very hard to see where that line is,
Yes.
especially if they don't have the education surrounding it.
So to me, I'm hearing that education would be like the number one um resource, like the number one thing for and I agree because I have to say my four kids, they're pretty well adjusted. And I remember we were very open because of my past, right? And what I learned. I mean, I'm an
Mhm.
educator, I were a therapist, so you learn these skills and tools. And I also remember I didn't have that, so I wanted to give that. Like I had brochures and my youngest son's just like, Mom, enough with the brochures. Because I had a brochure for every drug. You know, the free brochures you get from
Yeah,
SAMHSA or whatever. Right.
absolutely.
And so I would read through it with him. And he's just like, okay, people make choices and addiction is real. And I kept telling, like, you have addiction in your family. You have addiction. Like grandpa was this, I'm this, and you have to be careful. It's your choice now.
Absolutely. And giving them the power to have that choice. And I think what's
Mm,
so important too for
hmm.
anyone listening to understand is that, giving people education allows them to make the choice, whatever that is. But also, is somebody does not need to have an addiction or a substance use disorder to develop the adverse effects from cannabis,
True.
right? And
Yeah.
so, and because I see this happen a lot where the young man of the case I was describing, the first case I experienced, he would not have met criteria for a substance use disorder, right? He
Wow.
he was all he was doing was he was doing some like experimentation and one day used a really high potency product and went into a psychotic break um, and didn't come out of it, and had to be treated with antipsychotic medication. So that may be an extreme example, but I think it's important again, just from an education standpoint, to understand the risks associated with it. This is not solely an issue that impacts people that would meet criteria for a traditional addiction.
Wow. So say that someone's listening right now and they're like, yeah, I'm doing it. And I'm addicted and I don't know how to get out of this spiral or I want to know what else can I do? What do you do, right, at in your practice? Because let's talk about your practice a little so people
Mhm.
understand what you exactly do and go ahead and explain what full life comprehensive care is.
Sure. Yeah, I'll explain what it is, and then I'll go back to the question if like somebody's listening and feels like, hey, this is me. So, when my partner Brian Pagan and I, a business partner, founded Full Life, We had both worked in various residential inpatient mental health facilities for many years. And what we saw was a real gap in care for people discharging from treatment. There's traditional outpatient treatment is you go to a therapist, you go to a psychiatrist, maybe an intensive outpatient, but you have to be self-motivated to go. You have to be stable enough to go, and it's up to you to show up. And what we saw was that a lot of people that had more severe and persistent mental health issues, addiction problems, really didn't have the skill set to even manage their own outpatient care, which was the expectation upon discharge. And so we do a lot of case management, and what that looks like is it's based off of what's called assertive community treatment. So it's a targeted case management model where we go to the client in the community, right?
Okay.
So we provide the wraparound services, make sure they're getting to their appointments, they're taking their medication, they're getting to their therapist. We help them find jobs to get some purpose. We help them with budgeting. We take them to different support groups in the area and help them develop some type of recovery community. And recovery, I use that term generally to mean both addiction and mental health. And so some type of community as well as purpose through some type of vocation, and then maintaining their outpatient obligations like psychiatry and therapy. So we're kind of like a boots on the ground team to help facilitate the aftercare team. And then we have a team of outpatient therapists. And then also, which was unfortunately one of the reasons I had to cancel the last podcast, was we do a lot of crisis intervention work. So what ends up happening is a lot of families, they're in crisis, they don't know what to do. They call mobile crisis, they call the police. Maybe they call an outpatient therapist, and therapist is like, whoa, this is like, I'm an outpatient therapist. Like, I can't help you with this.
Yeah.
And so what we can kind of step in is like navigate and triage the crisis to help the person get to the right level of care. And we tend to work with a lot of people that one would consider higher risk, whether that be that risk due to be addiction or mental health, psychosis. But to your question earlier, when you
Yeah.
had mentioned about like, so someone's listening to this and they say, this really sounds like me. I'm using every day. I'm experiencing some negative effects. I think the first thing to understand, because this is a kind of misnomer that's talked about a lot, where people say, well, you can't withdraw from cannabis, right? But that's
No.
actually not true,
Right. No,
right?
I know. I
Yeah,
know.
yeah.
I
And
withdrew.
and it may not look like it may not have the severe withdrawal
Right.
effects from like alcohol use or benzodiazepines, where there's like seizure and cardiac failure
Mhm.
risks. But the withdrawal effects can look like agitation, low appetite, weight loss,
Yeah.
insomnia, anxiety, panic
Mhm.
attacks. Some people even report getting hot and cold sweats like after they're stopping. So I think the first thing to know is that it's going to be, it's not going to be an easy process.
Mm.
I think it's really important that they find somebody to work with that is familiar with this. Find that, whether it's a therapist, psychiatrist, combination of the two, that is willing to work with someone as they're trying to get off this. Because, what was always hard is like, there will be some, therapists or psychiatrists in the area, and I understand staying within your expertise. I think that's really important. But they'll say like, oh, I'm not going to work with you until you stop smoking. And I'm like, well, like, let's meet the person where they're at a little bit. If you're willing to work with somebody that has this issue, know that it may be a little bit of a process. So first thing is to find somebody that's really competent in working with that. And then, you essentially want to try to, implement some harm reduction at first, right? If you're not, some people are like, they show up and they're like, look, I'm stopping completely. I'm going cold turkey. Help me navigate this. And I say, great, we'll try and work through it. Other people are not ready to go full bore like that. And so what
Mhm.
this can look like is, maybe they stop the concentrates. So they no longer use the cartridges and the dabs, and they go to like more like traditional products. They try and limit the frequency that they use throughout the day. So kind of standard harm reduction techniques surrounding cannabis.
Mhm.
And really to try and build off. So what is motivating you to want to stop or reduce? So build off of that motivational. So kind of classic motivational interviewing,
Mhm.
figure out what is it? Is it that, you want to be more present with your family, you want to be more productive at work, you're experiencing some adverse effects that you don't like, whatever it is that's causing you to say, I want to make a change, build off that and use that to really start to taper off and eventually stop.
Okay. Is there When you do these talks at high schools, are there
Mhm.
resources you leave behind? Is there like websites or books or I mean, I don't know, or that you give the families that you work with? Like what practical tips or resource? I know with me now, what helps me so much, I have to have um breath work every morning and prayer and journaling and just being alone in nature. I mean, there's certain things that I do now, especially breath work, like breathing and stretching and just being connected with nature. That's what's helped me a lot with my anxiety now that I don't touch marijuana anymore. And I still have people in my life and my friends like I grew up with, like that we hung out and they still do it, but to me it's just like I guess I'm in a place where I'm like I don't want to be enslaved to things, right? Because
Yeah,
it becomes such a priority. It's an idol. It becomes an idol. And because I'm a woman of faith, so it's like, okay, why? And I had to go there with my therapist to get to the core of when did I start? Why did I start? How how it has it shifted and where do you want to go, like you said, building off motivational interviewing, and what resources do you give your clients, like what is it that you do without giving them everything, because you want to be hired, but but it's also like you're only one person, John, and I'm sure you're busy, so
yeah.
so am I, and this is why I have you on this podcast and why this podcast exists, because not everybody could afford therapy. Not everybody can work with us, but everybody can do one positive thing for themselves.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I think so. A couple things, points I wanted to make. The first is that I think you're incredibly right that getting to the core of what the cannabis or substance that you're using was doing for you, not just to you, right? So like, what was your reason for using? Like, what were you coping with? Incredibly important. And as far as resources are concerned, so there's several like totally free resources about this that really has like tons of information, education, free support groups for families. It's really incredible. So the first one is called Every Brain Matters.
Oh, wow.
Um, and it was founded by this woman, Aubrey Adams, who's absolutely incredible. She does a ton of advocacy work. She had her family, she's very open about this, it's all on the website and everything, but she had her family torn apart from cannabis. Both her son and her husband experienced some really adverse effects, then cannabis-induced psychosis. And so she leads a ton of there's tons of educational resources. She does groups all for free. They take donations, they're nonprofit. And then there's a similar group called Johnny's Ambassadors, and that is really more geared towards cannabis-induced psychosis specifically, where they
Mhm.
offer tons of resources, support groups for family members and loved ones. And and if you think about it, right, these are not like necessarily small organizations with small membership. So this is just it speaks to how widespread this issue is, that there are like two organizations that I'm aware of, and there's certainly more that really exist solely to provide families and people impacted with the resources and education to really help them navigate this. So though
Wow.
I can't say, and then again, they're two nonprofits that I've done some collaborative work with them in the past, and they're both excellent.
Are they out of Florida or just national?
They're national,
Okay.
so I believe Aubrey's out of Colorado, and
Mm,
I think I forget where Johnny's Ambassadors is out of, but all of it's all done virtual,
okay.
the support groups and everything like that. And so, yeah, I can't say enough great things about the organizations.
Well, thank you for that. I'm going to reach out and see
Yeah,
if somebody wants to come on the show to talk about their nonprofits, and also, yeah, I'll put that in. I'll research and put it in the show notes. Well, before we end up saying goodbye, John, is there anything else? Like, how are you taking clients?
so for my individual caseload, I am
Yeah.
not.
Okay.
But but my and that could change. But currently, I'm full with. I got a lot going on. But we have several therapists in the practice that also
Okay.
specialize in the issues that are supervised by me. That can absolutely work with someone with the types of problems that we've been discussing.
Okay. And so, do you do online therapy throughout Florida?
Yeah, so it's online, virtual throughout Florida, and then as I mentioned, the case management is more localized to Palm Beach County and Broward County,
Okay.
and the crisis intervention work where we, jump into the crisis, so to speak. That can be anywhere in Florida as well.
Okay, good to know. And I'll put your website on in the show notes as well. Well, I really appreciate your time on this subject. This is, we could have probably talked about 100 other things, but because I wanted to bring up Baker Act and the CEU I took with you and Mark, but Mark actually touched on it when I interviewed him. So I really wanted people to understand the marijuana psychosis and what's happening, and that's a real thing. And you know, many people don't take it as serious, and I get it. Like legalizing it, it's gonna. I have a feeling it's gonna eventually happen here, recreationally. But the thing is, like, you couldn't make it illegal. People are still gonna get it. I mean, it's like,
Yeah.
to me, it's education and understanding and learning and giving people different tools, right? To be able to cope. Because most people, I think, start doing drugs, honestly, due to maybe like the top three things would be what? Curiosity, um, lessen pain, and what else? I mean,
Yeah, so you're right. It's curiosity, lesson plan, and it's boredom, right?
yes,
And it's,
that's it. That's
yeah,
in
yeah,
boredom.
yeah.
Oh,
And less in physical, emotional, pain. I mean, absolutely. That's one of the primary reasons for sure.
yeah. And I mean, and addiction goes across all different kinds too. So it is like John and I, as therapists and clinicians, we're just trying to first do no harm, and second, to give out the tools to help the human so they have a good life in a healthy way, right? And so I really appreciate you coming on. Is there anything you would like to say to the audience before we say goodbye?
No, I mean, thank you for having me. I think we really did cover everything, and always happy to answer any more questions. So thanks so much for having me.
John, thank you for coming on. And remember, dear human, trust in the Lord, guard your heart, and renew your mind. Bye. And now for the disclaimer to make sure you understand that you are responsible for you. The content provided on the Holistic Counselor podcast is for entertainment and informational purposes only and is not intended as a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Always seek the advice of your physician or other qualified mental health provider with any questions you may have regarding a medical or mental condition. Never disregard professional medical advice or delay seeking it because of something you have heard on this podcast. The views expressed on this podcast are my personal opinions and do not represent the views of any professional organizations with which I am affiliated. Call your doctor, 911, or 988 immediately if you have a medical emergency. The Holistic Counselor podcast does not recommend or endorse any specific tests, physicians, products, procedures, opinions, or other information that may be mentioned on the podcast. Reliance on any information provided by the Holistic Counselor podcast, guests appearing on the podcast at the invitation of the Holistic Counselor podcast, or other listeners to the podcast is solely at your own risk. Confidentiality notice. If you engage with the Holistic Counselor podcast by commenting or posting and are a client, please be aware that you may be revealing information that could compromise your confidentiality. Please remember that disclosing your identity or personal details can be linked to your clinical material. As a therapist, I am bound by confidentiality and will not respond to any disclosures of this type on this podcast. I am committed to upholding the ethics and confidentiality of the therapeutic relationship, which extends to all forms of communication in accordance with the laws and professional guidelines that govern mental health professionals. I want you to know that your privacy is of utmost importance, and you are responsible for protecting it when interacting on this platform or any other public forum. Thank you.